Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. A couple of clarifications. I think we go back to Dr. Liew's paper on freedom of speech and also subsequently what both of you have shared. I noted your confirmation that deliberate online falsehoods should not be protected in the name of the freedom of speech. Could you elaborate on that? Oh, yeah. I know the question sounds like a no-brainer, but we have also had, people who have argued in the name of freedom of speech. So I'd like to hear your views.
I think in the normal functioning of a society, everybody is entitled their rights to their opinions. However, if the opinions infringe on the well-being of others, then that will threaten the harmony and the well-being of the society, and therefore that cannot be tolerated. So while we espouse freedom of speech, it should be qualified that it will not undermine the functioning of the society. So that's why I think the deliberate online falsehood must be curtailed and cannot be used and abused all in the name of the freedom of speech.
So essentially what we have here is a balancing of the different rights within a bundle that everyone is entitled to. Freedom of speech, your right to safety, your right to life, peaceful livelihood, and so on. So if there is a threat to all those other freedoms, then there could be some curtailing.
That's right.
Of course, we have to tread very carefully because freedom of expression is enshrined in our Constitution. It is a basic human liberty.
Yes,
I'm interested to find out your view on truth as opposed to fact. Yeah, because you mentioned that truth is socially constructed. And yesterday also we heard from our other witnesses their view that truth is a very different matter. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it seems that if, for a given matter, if the facts can be laid out unambiguously, then it is no longer, social construction of truth will no longer be necessary because that can be established. For example, the molecule of water is H2O, so that becomes a fact, and that is also a truth. So there's no argument about it. But when there are multiple perspectives, but multiple layers of meaning, and things are not so clear-cut, so more gray, and I think in the normal functioning of society, then truth is socially constructed. So for example, filial piety, what does it mean to be filial to one's parents? So different cultures will express that quite differently. So within a particular context, that is regarded to be the truth, and that's the way things are done.
So given that again, I know you said it's not fluid, but I think there is some fluidity in the way you have described it. Given that, how do you then define falsehood? What is your definition of falsehood?
Okay. So in my submission, I define falsehood as something that's contrary to fact. So if you make a claim and the claim can be refuted unambiguously, then that can be deemed a falsehood. So if somebody has not passed away and you say the person has passed away, then obviously it can be verified, and that is actually a falsehood.
So if I take an example of filial piety, the filial piety, you say in certain cultures, a particular statement about filial piety could be the truth, and in others, so it's actually more like a value.
Yeah, that's right. So I think
rather
truth
than
and value, I think it's all enmeshed in a sociological context.
Okay, so if Dr. Puducherry did mention, but in the context of social security, race and religion, then how would you deal with this?
That's right. So in Singapore, we believe in a multicultural, multilingual society. So that becomes our values, and therefore this is a truth that we want to uphold. So in other societies, maybe one race is more domineering than the others. One race is more important than the others. But in our case here, we value multiculturalism, and that becomes our value, and that's also our truth. That's how we define ourselves.
And therefore, that's something that we need to protect.
That's right.
Not just for social cohesiveness, but also as part of our national security objective.
That's right. That's right.
Yesterday, we also heard a differentiation between a criticism of religion and criticism of practitioners of that religion. The alternative, well, a couple of the witnesses before us from the other social media sites, they have said that, one or two of them have actually said that it is acceptable, that they think it is acceptable to criticize religion, but not necessarily the practitioners. Do you see a distinction in that?
No, I find that one should not criticize a religion or practitioner. I think this is a no-no, given what we really value and what we espouse as a country. So I think criticism against a religion or practitioner shouldn't be allowed.
Okay, so in any event, therefore, we should guard all this very jealously. Okay, then I come to your point also about, how Dr. Liew's table on the green, amber, and red light, and also your grid. In general, we agree. I think that we need to look at falsehoods over a spectrum. Likewise, also take a calibrated approach. The only question is when one crosses over to the other. And obviously, would you be aware of something that starts as a very, very innocuous statement, which could then ultimately become an incitement or incendiary or inflammatory? Because it could also take the conflation of different statements made over a period of time as well. And also with social media, the way it amplifies, right, and spreads, that period of time could be very, very compressed. So how do you deal with what appears to be innocuous statements?
I think I made one of my case studies in my submission, which I should not elaborate or name the country involved. But these are the kind of low-level, undercurrent, daily conversations around, that you cannot control within the borders of the nation-state. It's a transnational conversation. It's inflammatory. People respond to it. It takes on religious significance. And right now, nothing is happening on a normal day, but I feel that we need not just a legal process, an administrative as well as a political mechanism to monitor and flag these issues. And if possible, raise them to the larger public, because sometimes people may not know that they are venturing into dangerous terrain. It's like just a lagoon that you need to flag some of the deep waters. And the kind of implications of their actions, to be sucked into this whole debate, what appears to be a debate, but turning into a kind of like foreign operation in some ways.
And so indeed, we therefore deal a lot more, I think, in the green area, although
we pray that it doesn't go to the other colors.
Yeah, but I think that tipping point. Yeah. The difficulty is determining when that tipping point is, and at which point then do you take more drastic action. And of course, there are suggestions that perhaps we should intervene and preempt. The question, of course, is whether you prefer to hang a murderer or you want to prevent a murder, right? So the thing is, at which point do you then want to intervene? And of course, we've also heard evidence to say that, there's this backfire effect. You take it down, then people will say, oh, why did you take it down? And so on and so forth. And then it spreads. But on the other hand, we've also heard evidence of Dr. Khiun on the cognitive impact that falsehoods have, as well as our inclination to believe somehow unsavory posts than the truth. Plus the fact that, when we try to debunk a falsehood, that falsehood is actually reinforced in our consciousness and subconsciousness. And that makes it even harder to debunk. So I think we're actually dealing with a lot of challenges like this to come to that, what you might call a happy place, but I doubt very much if we could ever find it. Yeah, your views on that?
So I would say that there are some countries like the People's Republic of China that have taken their own social media. They have blocked Facebook and other Western-based social media platforms. They have their own Weibo. Conversations and discussions are mainly taken in Chinese, actively monitored. So it's insulated and inoculated. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So I think we have to accept the degree or certain level of, these falsehoods that will continue to persist. And I feel that legislation, I think all of you agree here, will not be the answer as well. You just couldn't come up with a new law and expect the world to be at ease and harmonious. So I think it must be supplemented by very active political and administrative measures.
Thank you. I have one final point, and that relates to the social media platforms. I noted that you did say that they're also pushing up content, and they should be responsible for that content as well. So, what is your view on their argument that they should be allowed to self-regulate?
I think in general, they can self-regulate until such a point where their self-regulation is malfunctioning. So for example, after self-regulating, we still find falsehood lingering around spreading. This may not be high-impact falsehood, but that seems to persist. And therefore, I think something has to be done to clamp down on such spread. So my opinion is that for media companies, if they are pure platform providers, it's fine. But they are not pure platform providers. They're actually pushing out information, and that makes them culpable to any spread of falsehood.
Indeed. So would you agree that if therefore we have evidence that the platform companies and the tech companies are, they're obviously content providers as well, right, in that sense?
Yeah.
And that we have evidence that they have failed to regulate themselves in enforcing their own policy or in the way they have interpreted or applied their own policies, then there is room for us to argue or to implement some form of regulation on them in relation to content.
Yeah, certainly so.
Okay, thank you. No further
thank you.
questions.
Yes.
Professors, thank you for taking the time this morning. Can I just ask some clarification from the both of you, in particular, Prof. Liew? You spoke earlier about situations where there's crisis in the real world. For example, a pandemic or infectious disease epidemic, a riot, some incident, and then there are deliberate online falsehoods that seek to exacerbate the situation. And you said specifically that the government needs to be more of a lifeguard, lean forward, take forward gear actions to prevent the situation from escalating out of control. I'd like to just ask you for your views on two specific scenarios. The first is that there's no crisis in the real world. It's okay, but some deliberate online falsehood on social media then creates that real world crisis. For example, by sparking a protest, a riot, a run on the bank. So it's not a crisis and then falsehoods appearing to then fan the flames, but it was sparked off using and exploiting social fault lines. The second scenario would be more insidious. It's deliberate drip, drip, drip situation, where again it's deliberate from various parties and seeking to stir, to sour, basically set up the firewood, if I may say. Yeah. So, figuratively, they set up the firewood where no firewood existed, with a view that sometime in the future you set the fire. So three scenarios. One is real world crisis, and people come in with DOFs to fan the flames. You said that lifeguard approach, meaning government needs to be more interventionist, needs to keep control of the online spread of falsehoods. I'd like your views on the other two scenarios. One would be where a deliberate online falsehoods creates an acute situation on the ground in the real world. And the second situation where there's a drip, 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 whether by one party or multiple parties acting alone or in concert, to sour the ground, to stir a situation, to deepen social fissures. And this just creates the conditions in the real world for the situation to be ignited.
I think, fortunately, Singapore has not experienced that yet. I would say yet. and that there's actually, because of the kind of like transnational nature and the globalized nature of such connectivities, the situation is more complicated than like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So there's, I mean, I think forces would make use of, first of all, underlying or existing tensions. So no smoke without fire. Any measures have to be, I would say that address even not through the online sphere. The politics has to be done way before, because by the time it can be provoked, I think there is already a situation that it may be too late. But I mean, maybe we're talking about situations that kind of happen all of a sudden, like an epidemic that breaks out. So that could be different. But the underlying undercurrent tensions, like I would say, like Little India Riot, for example, it was a sudden outburst. I remember it vividly, seeing the kind of social media feeds. But there were also pre-existing tensions and grievances, congested environments, poor working and living conditions, for example. So I think these are the issues that, it cannot just be addressed with a sudden surge in policies or laws. It has to be done persistently, patiently, and quietly on a daily basis, to build these bonds together. And also, but not forgetting that, the populace should also be made aware that, such forces are there to take advantage, to exploit the situation, should something happen. So it's something that is based on what we do every day rather than how we react all of a sudden. But of course, if things happen, and we have to expect that it will happen. Because I do sense that sometimes there's this idea that we need to isolate or protect ourselves completely. It wouldn't work, It happens in every society, and we have to be prepared to deal with it. Thank you.
Okay, in my research, I come across two types of users within the social media environment. One is called the stiflers, and the other one is called the spreaders. Stiflers are people who receive message and then they will not spread. The message just end with them. Spreaders are those who pass along the message. And then how do we distinguish between stiflers and spreaders? And one of the quite strong predictor of their role is known as the epistemic belief or epistemological sophistication. So this is basically their perception about the characteristics of knowledge and the process of knowing. So people who view knowledge as a simple kind of things that can be obtained easily, then they tend to be spreaders because there's no critical thinking. So this is in addition to the information and media literacy we talk about. So that's a psychological disposition. So I think this is more of a long-term approach. So in the second scenario that you painted, where somebody create an acute ground situation where nothing exists, and if we have more stiflers than spreaders, then soon there is no traction to fan the thing out, and then it just die by itself. So like most of the rumors research I've done, they die a natural death after a while. So the death might come earlier. I think what I fear more is the drip feed kind of syndrome, because it's so insidious and nobody knows about it. So I think this is a lot more complex than that we can deal with just with simple legislation or initiatives. I think this is multimodal, multi-pronged, and maybe a long-term approach. Maybe this is really the holy grail of combating against online falsehood, to guard against drip feed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask a second question? And that is in relation to the impact of social media on the importation of disputes or tensions from abroad into Singapore. Singapore is one of the most religious diverse countries or societies in the world. We're multiracial, and we're also cosmopolitan, meaning people come through, they come into Singapore to live, work, play. We rely on them for some skills, especially in the construction work and all. In the distant past, if someone were to try to import some of their foreign conflicts, the domestic conflict from abroad into Singapore, for example, they tried to hold a demonstration involving a dispute in another part of the world where they come from, or a foreign preacher or religious leader would want to come and bring his or her brand of firebrand religion into Singapore, with the attendant consequences of a particular religious viewpoint and tolerance or lack thereof. We would have the tools, the regulatory tools to prevent that. Either you can't come in, or you can't use the space, you can't then have a box to stand on and a megaphone to amplify and spread these views and bring in a foreign problem into Singapore and make it domestic. What would you say that the social media has made that much more porous and much more difficult to police, and therefore different strategies need to be taken to prevent some of the import of foreign disputes?
Yeah, I agree, because in the past, messages get transmitted face-to-face, so we can stop the person from coming through the country, so the border is kind of watertight. But in the social media era, somebody can post YouTube videos, and then anybody in Singapore can access that video. So I think the landscape has changed and the boundary is indeed more porous. So I think to combat this again, there should be education within the population. And if the person belongs to a particular religion, then I think the onus is on that religion representation in Singapore to call this out as a falsehood. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister, for the question. And I would say that, yes, the social media has made it a lot more porous. You cannot just have a quiet word with a religious leader or representative, as in the past. You are not sure who is watching what. But what I can say that the plus point is that everybody is actually monitoring each other too. So the government has also came up with, for example, dealing with ISIS. If you suspect any of your friends online are watching radical materials, you should actually report them in. This has happened. One of this ISA detainees, Zulkifli, he was posting pro-ISIS materials online on his Facebook post. So people responded, they reported. And so there's also the citizenry have to play a role in that, in calling out each other, in monitoring the situation. The state apparatus cannot do it alone. So you need this broader consensus. You need a kind of awareness of people, for how to conduct yourself in the online space, what to look out for. I mean, part of the media literacy, but as I mentioned, that media literacy perhaps is only just one aspect. Legalities are also one aspect, so they have to be put together. And at the end of the day, when complaints are made, the government must be seen to be taking action. And I think that is the most critical element here. And not just ignoring, any of the grievances that have been aired in public. Thank you.
Thank you. Just my final question.
Yeah, sure.
And this is, the traffic light proposal is a very attractive one, which suggests that a lot of work has to be done on an everyday basis to monitor, to recognize, and to call out the drip effect, the corrosive effect, the subtle, surreptitious contamination of people's emotions and mindsets through deliberate online falsehoods. Because when it comes to a crisis situation, you must at least have done your homework in the weeks, months, and years before to try to avoid that situation. But I'm now focused on your red situation. Is it red color?
Yeah, red color.
Traffic light red. Whether it's a riot, whether it's a pandemic, where it's red hot, literally. You chose the color for a reason. And yesterday we heard two contrasting views about the kinds of legislative or legal levers that governments ought or ought not to have and ought or ought not to use in a red situation. And that is a very fundamental, the responses and the approach that we take in such a situation will kind of inform the entire approach that you take to deliberate online falsehoods, because it's a cascading effect. An example, I'll give you an example. So it's two different views, one by Ms. Kirsten Han and one by Professor Charan George. The example wasn't posed to Prof. Charan George, but he in fact articulated something quite similar. And so I give you an example. This is a 2014 fake video that was carried by a local news network in Myanmar about a Buddhist girl who was raped by Muslim men, 2 Muslim men. It was later, according to news reports, allegedly it was later proven to be false. The girl had been paid to make those false claims. Those false claims were carried on the local news media and, of course, had many eyeballs. And a Buddhist monk with strong views about religious tolerance in his country decided to carry that on his post, and that added to the virality of it. It was the second situation I talked about earlier. It sparked a real-life situation where none existed. It was fake, and it sparked a real-life crisis. It resulted in injury and death and destruction of homes and property. People were killed, and all because of a fake video. So this example, to be fair, Prof. Charan George, it was not presented to him. But his point was, when there's such a crisis where people have used hate propaganda, hate news, and it's false, you don't spend time responding by distributing flyers about media literacy at the time. You must throw the book, you must act, you must nip the problem in the bud. And he mentioned take down, right? Stop, stem. On the other hand, Ms. Kirsten Han's philosophy, and that translated into her position, is that the video should not be taken down because her concern is on impact on freedom of expression, but specifically the concern that if we take down, it will create a bigger problem in that you will have what do you call that, blowback situation. You know, people will backfire situation. I'm sorry, backfire situation will occur. You will exacerbate the problem, and therefore don't take down the post because you're concerned about backfire. And the second point was that if there are already these social tensions, then having it, not having it, taking it down, not taking it down will not help the situation. In that kind of crisis situation, I'd like to just hear your application of the traffic light approach and fundamentally what philosophies will drive you in that kind of crisis situation.
Maybe from the way I predict technology innovations, that in future, or even when we're speaking now, something that has been posted will never be taken down. It will exist in other platforms. It can be, it will turn up somewhere else in other countries, or people can do a VPN access in other places. So, but the takedown principle is important for expressing a strong message. So it's not so much of the actual operational effect, but more of the symbolic political message that will be sent forward, that the government is serious about this, the authorities are acting on it, an unjust video has been, or a deliberately manipulative video or literature has been posted, and it should be called out on that. So I think that's my principle when we come to the red light, because I hope that doesn't happen to Singapore, that when you have a red light situation, lives are involved. And I would not suggest that we turn off the switch completely like Sri Lanka and Egypt in 2011. Because when you turn off the switch, you do also affect information flows that are more positive and constructive as well.
Professor, when you say it's symbolic, you have to call it out, are you saying that just taking down is not alone, you must call it out, you must explain why you're taking it down, why you're putting it out?
I think the government has been doing it now, right, for many of the instances. And that, so it's not just taking down, but, also explaining at the same time, so all this have to be done concurrently, not quietly, because if you do it quietly, it creates more conspiracy theories and more suspicion.
Even if, as you say, it will still linger somewhere.
Yes, it will linger somewhere.
The important symbolism of saying this involves lives, it is false, it's deliberate, we'll take that step, but we'll explain and call it out.
Yes, that's right.
Professor?
Yeah, okay, this is exactly what I feel. So the taking down itself cannot be done in isolation of other measures. So it has to be publicized in mainstream media and then get people to spread what is wrong. So the taking down itself is therefore interpreted in a larger context of protecting what we really value as a society. Yeah.
Thank you, professors, for your responses.
Thank you.